There's a concept in economics that supply follows demand. If there's a huge demand for something, for example, iPhones or any form of product, if there's a big demand, then the supply will come. But if there is not a big demand, then there's no reason to build a supply. Well, that concept is also true in psychology. If there's an extreme demand upon you to do something, you will find the mental resources or the resources in general to find it. As the historian Will Durant said, the ability of the average person could be doubled if the situation demanded it. That concept is actually called the PYGMALION effect in psychology, that your abilities rise or fall to the demands of your situation. Your outcomes rise or fall to the demands of your situation. So if you come from a really demanding environment, if you come from a family that wants a lot of you, you're going to find that supply. If you're in a situation where you absolutely must get the result, or else things are going to fall apart. This is one of the reasons why deadlines are so powerful. It's because when a deadline's coming, all of a sudden there's this huge demand on you and you have to create the result. You have to find that supply. You have to find that motivation. So the problem for most people is that there is not enough demand coming upon them from their situation. It's not necessary for them to achieve their goals. It's not necessary for them to achieve a certain outcome. For some people, the demand is required that they make over $1 million or else things are going to fall apart. They have a business. They might have to make tens of millions of dollars. And so you have to ask yourself, what are the current demands that your environment places upon you or your situation, but also what are the demands that you set upon yourself? What are the demands of your future self? What if you demanded that your future self achieve a certain goal? There's a concept that you have to first be before you can do and do before you can have. So if you have a clear future self, if you have something you absolutely want, you have to demand it. You have to demand that you get what you want, and that's the level of faith required to achieve your goals. The question is, do you demand of yourself and of life that you get what you want? What would happen if you demanded it? What would happen if whatever your goal is, whoever your future self is, you demanded that become your reality? What would happen if the demand was so strong that you found the supply? There's a great quote that says that basically nothing happens until after you're committed. Once you get fully committed to something, then providence moves too. Then all sorts of things come to pass, such as material assistance, the right mentors, the right people. You know, as the quote says, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. When the student is ready, they demand that the teacher appears. And so the question is, what would happen if you demanded that you achieve your results? Demanded it of yourself and demanded it of the world, demanded it of life, demanded it in your prayers, demanded it of your faith. What would happen if you became so committed to your result that you became willing to do whatever it takes? As the quote says, when the why is strong enough, you'll figure out how. Well, the first key to motivation is being 100% clear on what you want. And clarity of what you want all just comes down to making decisions. This is where most people get mixed up. This is where most people make things too complicated. Most people, they just say, I don't know what I want. Well, the ability to become a decision maker means you just have to select something. Select something that seems worthwhile, valuable. Rather than trying to find what you want, just say what is valuable, what is useful, what would be something worth having, and watch yourself then go through becoming the process of becoming the person. First, you have to decide, what does your future self possess? What do you want? What does your future self possess that you don't possess? It could be having your house paid off. It could be being an author. It could be whatever you want. It could be being in the most amazing relationship. It could be deeply being connected with God. It could be having the ability to travel. You have to actually clarify what your future self possesses that you don't. And then you have to be, do, and then have. You've got to then be your future self now. You've got to remove everything from your life that reflects what's current in your life in order to have or possess what your future self has. You have to actually embody the identity of your future self, because your behavior follows your identity, but your identity follows your goals. So in order to actually have a clear identity, you have to be very clear on what you want to possess. You have to be clear on what you value. If you're not clear on what you value and what you want to possess, then you're not clear on your identity. If you don't know what you want for your future, then you can't know who you are in the present. You could basically just be distracted and go a million different directions in the present until you get a clear direction. There's a lot of research on that in psychology. You can't know who you are in the present until you've defined who you want to be in the future. Until you've defined what you stand for, and until you've defined what you value and what you want to possess, you can't actually make conscious, clear decisions in the present. But once you've clarified specifically what you want, then ultimately you need to make that your identity. Then you have to demand that of yourself. And the way is easy. You start publicly telling people what you want. Most people, their identity or their story is based on the past. Their identity and their story is based on the past or the present. Most people are very definitive about who they are in the present. They say, I'm an introvert. I'm not very good with people. I make this much amount of money. What would happen if you made your story or your identity your chosen future self, what you demand of yourself and what you want to possess? If you made that your reality, meaning you made that your new story, once you start telling everyone about your true future self, once you make that the new narrative, your behavior always follows your identity. And your identity comes from your view of your future, and the problem for most people is that they're not demanding of themselves a very powerful future. You have to get very specific, and then you have to ultimately embody that identity. You have to own it. You have to own that that is your future, that that's what you're going to do, that there's no going back. And the moment you get 100% committed, which means you become highly public about it, you commit in your head, and ultimately you start committing in your behavior. You got to also start as an amateur. It's fine to start as an amateur. Sometimes it takes, often your behavior is what triggers your identity. In psychology, they call that self-signaling. And so if you have a goal, let's just say to own $5 million worth of real estate, well, maybe you need to actually get a few deals first. Get a few deals, watch yourself do it, and then realize, yes, I can do that. That's when you start building the confidence. Or in psychology, we call that identity capital. Once you see yourself do it a few times as an amateur, then you start to build the confidence and the desire that you can do this. As Napoleon Hill said, whatever the mind can conceive and believe the mind can achieve. Sometimes it takes working as an amateur to get to the point where you can actually believe it. Of course you can conceive it. I can conceive myself having a lot of money or some form of goal, whatever goal that is. But sometimes you've got to start as an amateur in order to get to the point where you actually believe it's possible. In order to actually see that there is a path to getting your goal. You need to have that path in order to achieve your goal. That's how you have motivation and hope. And so you got to start as an amateur, but eventually you've got to embody yourself as a pro. Eventually you've got to embody yourself fully as the person you want to be, and you've got to stop showing up as an amateur. Eventually you've got to stop showing up as a wannabe, and eventually you've got to just own that that is the reality you will have. As Eben Pagan said, he calls it inevitability thinking. Inevitability thinking is thinking and acting as if what you want is a foregone conclusion because you've set up the circumstances for it to happen. You've set up the environment, the conditions for it to happen. And so at some point, you've got to have this identity shift where it's the only reality that's going to happen. Rather than entertaining multiple futures or multiple realities, you set yourself fully and fixed on the one you absolutely want, and it becomes the only option. You cross your point of no return, you go highly public about it, and you start acting as that new person. Be, do, have. You just own that that is your identity. You own that that's who you are. You own that that's what you're going to do, and you own that those are the realities, and you own that that's the outcomes you're going to produce. And then you behave from the perspective of your future self. You behave through your new identity, and ultimately you'll have whatever you want. You can become whatever you want, but you have to fix in your mind what you want. And then ultimately you've got to make that your new identity so that your behavior flows through that. You have to own that that's who you are. And you have to ultimately start being that person in all ways. Remove all of the, what Robert Brault would call lesser goals. We're kept from our goal not by obstacles, but by a clear path to lesser goals, is what Robert Brault said. So eventually you've got to just remove your lesser identity. Eventually you've got to remove the lesser behaviors, the addictions, the distractions of your former self. And eventually you've just got to fully embrace everything that's involved in being this new identity. Be, then do, then have. Demand it of yourself. Supply follows demand. If you demand that you achieve a certain result, the supply will follow. The supply is not only in your own motivation, but also, as Henry Hutchinson Murray said, mentors, financial assistance. What do you demand of yourself, and what do you demand of your future? That's my question of you. A lot of people, they just don't demand that much of themselves. As the PYGMALION effect states, we are either rising or falling to the demands of not only our situation, but of our identity. And if your identity demands that you reach a certain financial situation, if your identity demands that you get to a certain place so that you can do something very important, when the why is strong enough, you'll find the how. If you don't demand much of yourself, you're not going to get much of yourself. You're going to have a weak identity. You're going to have a weak purpose. You're going to be weak in the present unless you demand a lot of yourself. If you're clear on your future and you demand a lot of yourself, then your present will be spent usefully. Your present will be spent consciously. Your present will be spent powerfully stretching towards a purpose. As Viktor Frankl said, what man needs is not a tensionless state. What man needs is the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal, a freely chosen task. That's the great part about all this. You don't discover your future self. You don't find your future self. You have to choose it. It's a freely chosen task. You are an agent, a free agent. You get to choose ultimately what you do with yourself. You get to choose the future that you ultimately direct your future, you direct your present towards. You have to choose. If you don't choose, indecision is a decision. And so ultimately, it's not a tensionless state that you need. It's the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal. That's how you live a good present. Without that, you're wasting your time. Without that, you're fading away. Without that, you're ultimately distracted and being steered by endless mazes of other people's agendas. So you have to fix your mind on what you want. You've got to make that your new identity. You've got to then fully own it at some point. You eventually get to the point where you own it by first starting as an amateur and then getting to the point where you conceive and believe it. And then at some point you just say, this is the only reality I'm going for. I'm going for it. I don't care what other people think. This is my new narrative. This is what I'm going for. I'm no longer embarrassed. I'm no longer ashamed of my future self. I'm no longer ashamed of my true goals and ambitions. This is who I am now, and I'm not hiding it from anyone. And then your behavior aligns with your future self. And then you quickly create the results you want. Then you start using your time effectively. Then you start using your days productively. How you spend 24-hour periods, your days, how you spend days really matters. How you spend 24-hour blocks of time determines how successful you'll become. And once you become committed to your future self, then you can start spending your days effectively. You can start building your environment and your life around being in flow and doing what Brian Tracy calls eating the frog. You can actually take action towards your first goals. You can start removing the lesser goals. You can start removing the lesser demands. You can start removing the wrong people. And ultimately, you can make your time and energy and thoughts focused. In psychology, the concept is simple. It's called selective attention. Dan Sullivan, the founder of Strategic Coach, has said, your eyes can only see and your ears can only hear what your brain is looking for. Well, you can't train your brain to look for something and to find what you're looking for if you haven't fixed in your mind what you wanted and then ultimately demanded that it happens. Once you fix in your mind what you want, and it's, by the way, your choice, as Frankl said, it is a freely chosen task. You get to choose the future you want. You get to choose the person you become. But you have to choose, and once you choose and then once you train your identity, then you train your worldview, because we all see the world in a subjective manner. We all see different things. We all create different meanings and interpret different things in different ways. But you get to train your worldview to find and to see what you're looking for. If you want to become a millionaire, you can train your worldview to ultimately get what you need and learn and surround yourself with the right people to become that. If you want to become a professional, anything. If you want to find God, you can train your worldview to do that. You ultimately train your subjective perspective, but you do that by choosing goals. You do that by choosing a goal, you do that by choosing a future, and ultimately by training your identity, and then ultimately training your thoughts, your desires, and your behavior to become who you want to be. And by the way, we all do this. What we desire consistently over time, we eventually become, as Neil A. Maxwell said. But most people, they don't consciously train their desires. Instead, their desires are implanted to them by the outside world. As Zig Ziglar said, your input shapes your outlook. Your input shapes your outlook. Your input shapes your thoughts, your desires, and your behavior. And most people, their inputs are through social media, through the news, through their friends. They haven't chosen their goal and then designed their environment and designed their inputs to create the worldview and the behavior and the desires they want. As Marshall Goldsmith said, if you do not create and control your environment creates and controls you. Most people are automatons. Their desires, their worldview, their thoughts, their goals are being driven by social media and by other medias created by other people, by basically propaganda. The only way you can start controlling your environment, controlling your inputs to control your outlook, is when you define a clear future self. And then ultimately train your identity and train your selective attention or train your worldview so that that's what you see, that's what you find, and that's what you get. It's up to you. But if you demand it of yourself, you can create insane goals. You can achieve them very quickly. You can skyrocket past most people because most people are not clear and most people are being torn in a million different directions. How do you define success for yourself? Do you even know how you define success? How are you measuring success for yourself as a person? There's a theory in psychology called the self-determination theory. And what that theory shows is that as people, we all have the need to have autonomy and competence. We all need to feel like we've got the ability to choose for ourselves what we want, that we have a choice and that we can ultimately choose for ourselves what we want. The problem is that self-determination is very difficult because we live in a world where it's very invasive. There's lots of marketing, there's lots of messages, there's lots of FOMO. And so chances are how you measure success wasn't even chosen by you. You might be measuring success based on who you're trying to compare yourself with or who you're trying to compete with. So the question number one is, how are you currently measuring success? That's first. What are you actually measuring? We all have certain measurements. We're all measuring certain things. As an example, back when I was 18 years old, the thing that I was measuring as success was how much progress I was making as my character on World of Warcraft. That was a thing that I was seeking and striving for and trying to accomplish. And so whatever it is you're trying to accomplish right now, that's how you measure success. Now, in order to know who you are as a person and to know what your identity is, you need to know what you're defining as success. What is your success criteria as a person? How do you define success, and how are you measuring success? Now, that's step number one. Step number two is actually very powerful. It's looking back at your former self and assessing how did they measure success, and how have your measurements changed over time? How have your views of what you care about, what you value, and what you're seeking, how have those changed over time? As I just stated, my former self, when I was 18 years old, I wasn't doing much. I was living at my cousin's house, sleeping on his couch, and playing World of Warcraft all day. And how I measured success back then was how far my character was growing on World of Warcraft. Now, you can do this at multiple time blocks. And actually what I recommend you do is look at what you're currently measuring as success. Look at the current outcomes you're creating. It could be in terms of your income. It could be whatever it is you're trying to accomplish in your life. What progress are you making, and how are you measuring that success? And how do you actually look back and see that success? This is something that Dan Sullivan, the founder of Strategic Coach, calls measuring the gain. As people, we're always measuring something. One of the big problems, though, is that as people, we're usually measuring ourselves in a terrible way. We're either measuring ourselves against other people, or we're measuring ourselves against our expectations, against what we want in the future. Let me give a quick example of that. Recently, we took our kids to Disney World. We live here in Florida, and we bought lunch while we were at Disney, and my wife bought a cookie and broke it into 4 pieces to share with the kids. One of my kids really wanted that cookie, but then he was incredibly sad once he got his piece because it was a little smaller than the other kids. So he was sad because he was measuring his experience against someone else. He was comparing his experience, and he felt it was unfair. There's actually a lot of research in behavioral economics on this situation. As people, we don't like when things feel unfair, and so we would rather lose. We would rather have nothing than feel we were unfairly treated. And that unfairness is actually illogical. It's by comparing our situation against someone else's. My son, in this case, could not appreciate his gain. He couldn't appreciate the fact that he had a piece of cookie. He couldn't enjoy his own experience because he was measuring his experience against someone else's, which put him in what Dan would call the gap. And so why I want you to think about, what are you measuring yourself against? Number one, if you're not clear on what you're measuring yourself against, then you can't have intentional behavior. The more specific and clear you get on what you want, the more you can train yourself to go get it. In psychology, there's a concept called selective attention. We all have a mental filter through which we see the world. There's a great quote from Stephen R. Covey. Stephen R. Covey said, "We see the world not as it is, but as we are, or as we've been conditioned to see it." So none of us see the world the same way. When you're driving down the road, chances are you see other people who have your same car. That's selective attention. You notice things that are valuable or important or interesting to you, and you block out everything else. In psychology, that's called inattentional blindness. We're blind to everything except for what we're focusing on. And so why you want to know what you're measuring as success? First off, that's what determines your value system. How do you define success versus how your former self defines success? But also, what are you actually creating in terms of measurable outcomes compared to your former self? So for example, your income versus where you were at a year ago, or just the output that you're doing. It could be related to anything. It could be the amount of time you spend just totally focused with your kids. It could be your progress in your health. What are you measuring and what are you defining as success right now versus what did you define as success before? Here's something I would just recommend you do. Go back in time 1 year. Look at where you were a year ago and how were you measuring success and how are you defining success back then? How has your definition of success changed, but also how has your forms of measurement changed? How much progress have you made from your former self in terms of how clear you are on what you want, how you define success, and the actual results you're getting? That's a powerful experience to have, is to look at your actual tangible results, look at how you're defining success, look at what you value, what you're focused on, and what you're creating compared to your former self. Chances are, if you are someone who's making progress in your life, if you look back on what you were striving for and trying to accomplish last year, you can see massive progress. You can see that you've outgrown your former self. You can see that you're clear on what you want. You can see that you're a lot more specific in what you want. The more specific you are in what you want, the more you can train your mental filter to see it, create it, and go get it. And that's what you want to do, is you want to train your mental filter so that you can get it. Dan actually has a great quote on this. He says, your eyes can only see and your ears can only hear what your brain is looking for. That again is called selective attention. Whatever you train your brain to see, whatever you train yourself to want, you can go get it. And that's why it's powerful to clearly define your future self. Not to broadly define your future self, but to clearly define what is success to your current self and to your future self. What does your future self want? What does your future self value? There's a lot of research that shows that most people, they don't appreciate their future self. They don't think about their future self. Instead, they think about who they are in the present. They do things right here and right now that they want, but that ultimately could be to the detriment of their future self. Spending away their money, not investing in the bigger picture. Maybe making health decisions that are going to cost your future self their health and their longevity. If you're doing things right now based on only what you want, but you don't think about what your future self would want, then you're setting your future self up for disaster. Here's where the research gets really cool. The truth of the matter is that your future self will be a different person than you are, just like you're a different person than you were in the past. You can look at how you currently define success and then look at how your former self defined success. And you can see the difference. Your future self may have bigger goals, may create bigger outcomes. They may also have different goals based on different values. You may have had experiences over the last year that really helped you clarify what matters to you. Maybe you went through a tragedy or a trauma, and that really forced you to think about what you really want, and so now you define success differently. Maybe now you're focused more on relationships or more focused on your faith or your spirituality. But also, maybe you've made progress that have expanded your confidence, and so now you're striving for outcomes way up here, whereas your former self had no business even thinking about that. They couldn't even imagine it. So pulling this together, your definition of success is your identity. It's what you're striving for, it's what you're measuring, it's what you're trying to create. That is different from how your former self defined success. And if you look at your former self in terms of what they were actually measuring and in terms of what they were striving for and what they were defining as success, you can see, hopefully, that you've evolved and grown a lot. But the same is going to be true of your future self. Your future self knows things that you don't know. They're striving for things that you're currently ignorant of. They're working towards things that you can't even imagine. And so one of the things you want to do if you want to create massive growth in your life is, first off, you want to imagine who your future self is, and you want to think about how would they define success. What is success to my future self? What would they measure as important? What would they value? Now, you don't know all these answers, but the sooner you start thinking about these answers, the sooner you can start living intentionally right now. In psychology, the concept is known as prospection. Prospection is the idea that as human beings, we think about our future a lot, and we use our views of the future to create our plans, our actions, and our strategies right now. Now, if you don't know what your future self is going to want and what they're going to be up to, then how can you make conscious, thoughtful plans right now? It's all right to not have the whole thing figured out, but you use what you want. You use your knowledge of what you want to create in the situation you want to have in the future to define your success criteria now so that you can intentionally strive and create towards your future self. And then as you make progress forward, kind of going off Dan Sullivan's gain and gap model, every step you take forward, you can reference back towards your former self and see the progress you've made. There's a lot of research from B.J. Fogg. B.J. Fogg's a Stanford psychologist, and what he's found is that making progress and being successful is a lot easier when you feel good. That's why you want to celebrate your victories, celebrate your wins. Look back and see the progress you've made. Look back and see how much different your perspective is than your former self. Look at how much you've grown and how much you've changed. There was actually a really interesting interview between Daniel Kahneman and Adam Grant. These are two very famous, very successful psychologists. Daniel Kahneman is actually the only psychologist, I believe, that's won a Nobel Prize. He wrote the book called Thinking Fast and Slow. I believe that book came out about 10 years ago, and that book is like the tome of behavioral economics. It's how our brains work. And Adam Grant asked Daniel Kahneman, do you still see the world the same way that you did back when you wrote that book? And Daniel Kahneman said no. He said he's changed a lot in his understanding of how things work. And basically Adam Grant said, well, how do you feel about that? And Daniel Kahneman said, I feel great about it. I'm so glad that I see things the way I do now because I can see so much more than what my former self could see. And then Adam Grant was basically saying, well, how does that make you feel about the book? You know, the book came out 10 years ago, and if you maybe potentially disagree with some of the stuff in the book, how does that make you feel? And Daniel Kahneman basically said that was fine. You know, he didn't think any differently about the book. The book was a reflection of where his thinking was at the time, and that takes nothing away from the book. His current self, though, is expanded from his former self, and he's grateful that he can see that progress. He's grateful that he sees things differently. He's grateful that he's not as blind to things that his former self was blind to. So it's powerful to realize that your definition of success right now is hopefully more powerful than your former self's. Now, when you get clear on your definition of success, when you get really specific on what criteria you're measuring yourself against, you can then stop competing with anyone else. You can stop worrying about what anyone else is doing because you're not actually competing with anyone else. Your definition of success is different from anyone else's definition. And if you're truly living a self-determined life, where you're truly being autonomous, self-determination theory basically points to the idea that if you're going to have intrinsic motivation, it means that you're striving for your own success. You're striving for your own outcomes. And yes, you can draw from, learn from other people, but you're not competing with anyone else because no one else has the same end as you. No one else is striving for the same things as you ultimately. You get to choose what you want, and you can then block out all the noise. You can stop worrying about what other people are doing. You can stop competing with other people. You can start being more original, more authentic, more creative. You can run your own race. You don't need to worry so much about what other people think about you because you've chosen your own path, and you're owning that, and you're confident enough that you can do it. And you're also measuring yourself against an internal reference point, which is where you were before. You're always measuring yourself against where you were before. You're not measuring yourself against someone else, as my son was doing when he was having the cookie experience. Instead, you're focused on where you were before, and you're appreciating your progress. You're appreciating your gains. You're also using your experiences to better clarify and better determine what success means to you. And the more clarified you've got your success criteria, the more clarified you know what you're currently measuring, the more powerfully you can say no to everything else. The more courageous you can be about saying no. You can start rejecting things that your former self used to say yes to. You can start saying, this doesn't resonate with what I value anymore. This doesn't resonate with how I define success. I can say no to that. You can start courageously and intentionally and intuitively saying no. That no longer fits with how I define success. My measurements are now up here. These are the outcomes I'm trying to create. This is what I value in my life. And because I'm clear on that, I can say no to everything else. I can reject the things that my former self used to say yes to. And the same holds true of your future self. Once you get clear on your future self and on what your future self values and what they're trying to create, and on the circumstances you want in your future, you can then look at your current situation, your current behaviors, attitudes, situation, and you can start rejecting the things that are ultimately stopping you from stepping into your future self. So to zone this down, it's up to you to define success. But if you haven't defined success, and if you don't know what you're actually measuring, and by measuring, what I mean is there's certain things that you're paying attention to. When you're a college student, you may be measuring your grades. When I was 18 years old, I was measuring my progress on World of Warcraft. Right now, I'm measuring income. I'm measuring YouTube views. I'm measuring lots of different things. I'm measuring the time I spend with my kids. The question is, what are you measuring? What are you defining as success? So if you haven't clarified and defined success for yourself, then what that means is you're probably trying to compete with other people, or you're trying to measure yourself against what other people think, or you're too worried about what other people think, or you're trying to live up to the ideals of society. And that's not self-determination. That's having an external reference point where you're always measuring your life against something outside of yourself, or against even some expectation in your head, which makes you perpetually unhappy. It keeps you on the hedonic treadmill. So define success for yourself, get clear on your measurements, regularly reference back on your former self and see your own progress in how you're defining and measuring success. Say no and reject the things that are outside your measurement of success. Define your future self and what they want, and use that as a new baseline for what you reject in your life right now and what you say yes to and what you move forward towards. We all go through peaks and valleys, and the good things that happen in your life happen because of what you do during your valleys. The bad things that happen in your life happen because of what you do on your peaks. This is according to the book Peaks and Valleys by Spencer Johnson. This is one of the best books I've ever read. I've read probably 1,000 books at this point, studied psychology for over 10 years. This is one of the best books. And in this book, it explains, just as people, we all go through peaks and valleys. And as you go through valleys, challenges, it could be a health problem, it could be you lose your job, it could be random things that happen, it could be mistakes you've made. If you learn from those valleys, and if you take those valleys to ultimately become better, not bitter, you can then create better peaks in the future. COVID-19 is an example. Maybe your business fell apart in COVID-19. Maybe you had to adjust and learn things. If you learn during your valleys, you can create bigger peaks in the future. Only if you take those valleys and become better, not bitter. You've got to see those valleys as this is happening for me, not this is happening to me. This is what Dan Sullivan would call being in the gain rather than the gap. If you're in the gap, then when you're in a valley or when something bad happens to you, you're just resentful. You wish something was different. You're a victim. Whereas if you're in the gain, you take that valley and you learn from it, and ultimately you take what you learn to become better, and ultimately you can create better peaks in the future. Now, when you get on a peak, this is where most people shoot themselves in the foot. When you're on a peak, you can become overconfident. Maybe you've made more money than you've ever made. Maybe you're in a great position and you stop doing those things that ultimately got you out of the valley and onto the peak. You stop doing the basics. You stop reading great books. You stop doing the morning routine. You stop ultimately moving forward in your life. When you're on your peak, it's easy to get indulgent. Actually, Greg McKeown in his book Essentialism, he spent the whole book explaining this idea. He wondered, why don't people who become successful ultimately go on to become very successful? And the reason he found is that once you get successful, first off, you get overly distracted, because once you get on a peak, you have way more opportunity. And once all that opportunity comes, it ultimately distracts you from being focused on your work. And so you end up getting distracted, you become overconfident, maybe you invest your money poorly, maybe you start overspending. That's what happens. As people start making more money, their expenses go through the roof. And ultimately, because people are either overconfident, distracted, unclear, or ultimately just make bad decisions, they fall off their peaks and create unnecessary valleys. So part of what this book is about how when you get on your peak, you ultimately don't want to self-sabotage. You want to extend those peaks, not get overconfident or lazy or indulgent on those peaks and create unnecessary valleys. So again, the premise is good things happen in your life because of what you do in your valleys, whereas bad things happen in your life because of what you do on your peaks. And ultimately, you want to go from peak to peak to peak, and that's what brings me to book number 2, The Big Leap. What this book teaches, which is most important, is a concept called the upper limit problem. So Gay Hendricks is a psychologist. He's the one who wrote the book. And the upper limit problem is basically the idea that as people, we all have an emotional baseline, a subconscious baseline. And usually when people start to make progress or improvements in their life, they start to, for example, really improve their relationships, or they start making more money, or they start getting in shape. As you start creating peaks in your life, you subconsciously self-sabotage. You hit the upper limit problem. That's the concept. Once you hit the upper limit problem, as you start making improvements in your life, ultimately what you end up doing to get back to your emotional safety zone, your subconscious baseline, is you subconsciously self-sabotage yourself. That's how you ultimately rob yourself when you're on a peak, when you start making improvements in any area. It could be anywhere where you're making progress and improvements in your life. Ultimately, because you hit this upper limit problem, you end up self-sabotaging yourself and pulling yourself back to your emotional baseline and reverting back to what your comfort zone is. And so you want to ultimately avoid the upper limit problem by going from peak, staying on that peak, staying there and turning that to your new normal, your new identity, and ultimately then using that as the launching pad for going from that peak to bigger peaks. And that's ultimately what takes me to the third book, which is a free ebook download by Dan Sullivan called The 4 C's Formula. Down below, you can download the ebook for free. It's a short little book. But the 4 C's Formula basically walks you through the growth cycle of any endeavor. So the first C is commitment. In order to actually create a new future, you've got to commit to a specific future. There's actually a quote from the book, The 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership, and they say, commitment is a statement of what is. You can know what you're committed to by the results you're getting. And so essentially, commitment is not what you want to have, commitment's what you do have. So wherever you're at in your life right now, that's what you're committed to. And if you want something new, you've got to commit to that new future 100%. Commitment is the starting point of all growth, and commitment is what most people lack. So the first thing you do is ultimately clarify what you want and commit 100% to that. And your future self, whatever it is you want, your future situation, your future scenario, is by virtue above and beyond your current situation. You're committing to something more and better than you currently have. And by committing to that, you now push yourself into the second C, which Dan calls courage. Because you're committing to an outcome or a situation that's above and beyond your current level of capability and confidence. You don't have the capability, the knowledge, the skills, but you're committing to a level. For example, if you want to be a millionaire, if you want to have a certain goal, or if you want an amazing relationship, you're committing to something above and beyond. Your future self is way beyond your current self. And so because of that commitment, that forces you into a state of courage. Courage is going outside your current knowledge, skills, abilities. It's going out of your comfort zone and ultimately going through the learning process. You start failing, you start learning, you start ultimately asking better questions, developing the mental model or the mindsets of this new level, learning the principles of this new level. So commitment leads to courage, and you can actually know how committed you are to something based on how much courage you're exercising. One of the things that I love that Dan says is that courage doesn't feel good. I spent actually a lot of time studying the psychology of courage in my PhD program. From a psychology standpoint, courage is basically the intentional pursuit of a worthwhile goal. You're the one who determines if it's worthwhile. That involves some form of risk. You see it as risk. Courage can be risky. Courage means that it might not work out. Courage means that you could fail. But as you go through that courage cycle as you're learning, trying, failing at your new goal. Ultimately, through that process, you start to develop new capability. That's the third C. By learning, by doing something over and over again. Just as an example, when I first started blogging online, it took a lot of courage in the beginning. I committed. When I was a graduate student, I had no writing under my belt. I wanted to become a professional author, and I committed 100% to that. Part of committing, by the way, is investing money into that goal. I bought a domain name. I bought an online course. But another part of it is ultimately taking action. There's a great quote from James Clear in the book Atomic Habits where he talks about how every action you take is a vote for the kind of person you want to become. And so ultimately, as you take action, as you exercise courage, doing things outside your comfort zone, seeking to become your future self, you're ultimately confirming to yourself the type of person you want to become. That's why habits are so powerful. In psychology, they call that self-signaling. Over time, you start to identify with your future self, but also over time through exercising courage and going outside your comfort zone, you actually develop the capabilities of your future self. You develop new capabilities. You learn skills. You learn knowledge. You maybe develop relationships that you didn't have before. You now have new capability because you exercised courage, because you went through that learning cycle. You have new capabilities that you didn't have before. And because of those new capabilities, you now have the fourth C, which is a higher level of confidence. And then confidence ultimately is you on a new peak. You're at that new peak. You have new capability, new confidence, new ability to produce results. And confidence then becomes your new launching point for imagining goals. Imagination is more important than knowledge, as Albert Einstein said. One of the amazing things you want to do is once you're on a peak, you can then actually see peaks beyond. You can see things that you couldn't see in your former valleys. You now know things your former self didn't know. Just like in the case of your future self will know things that you don't know. They'll be able to see things you can't see because they'll be on a peak that's way above where you're standing right now. And so your future self will be able to imagine and pursue goals and meanings that you just currently can't even imagine right now. And so once you go through that 4C cycle, you commit to a specific goal, you then go through the courage cycle of working through the learning process, learning, failing, developing higher level capabilities, maybe relationships, connections, network, then you have a new level of confidence. So basically you're now on a new peak. And so you have the potential of hitting a new upper limit problem. Once you get to that level, you're now on this new level. You might want to revert back to your former valley because now up at this new level, you're uncomfortable a little bit because this is now new territory for you. Ultimately, you can quickly adapt to it and you can make that your new normal. It's a lot easier to make that your new normal if you've clarified your future self and all along the way through that courage cycle, you've actually just been reinforcing the identity that that's who you are now, that's how you operate. Your identity is the story you tell about yourself. And so it's a lot better just to be clear about your identity from the beginning. Start with your future self, use that as your new story, commit to that. Ultimately invest in that, go through the courage cycle of learning that, and then through your actions and habits, you ingrain that as your new identity. And so it can quickly become your new normal. And so what I love about Dan's 4 C's is actually this model teaches you how to go from peak to peak rather than unnecessarily going from peak back to valley because you sabotage yourself with the upper limit problem. Ultimately, what Dan says is this: courage does not feel good. It doesn't feel good to step outside your comfort zone in the moment, because you're trying new things, you're learning, you're facing emotions, but it's actually a great opportunity to become what psychologists call psychologically flexible. As you're outside your comfort zone, as you're trying new things, as you're facing uncertainty, as you're failing to some degree, you can become more flexible, more adaptive. You can become what's called tolerant of ambiguity. You can become comfortable actually being outside your comfort zone. Even still, it's slightly uncomfortable and it can be challenging going through that learning process. But once you have a higher level of confidence and a higher level of capability, confidence feels great. And that's why people can turn their peaks into valleys, is because they feel good. They're confident in their new position. They feel great about what they've just done. And that's why I love what Dan says. He basically says, don't stay on that peak too long. Go back to committing again, back to another future and go through the cycle again. The purpose of getting onto the peak, developing all those skills, abilities, is so that you can then envision new and better peaks and then go back to the cycle of committing again to a new future self and then going through the process, the courage process of developing new skills, new capabilities, and then ultimately new confidence. And so if you go from peak to peak to peak, you can keep going. You can be smart on your peaks. You don't have to fail backwards and keep going back and forth. Instead, you can get onto a peak, really be thoughtful, really be wise, learn from it, establish that as the new norm, build new security around it, a new system around it, and then commit to a better future. And you can go from peak to peak to peak. That's why I love these 3 books, Peaks and Valleys. It just explains that we all will go through peaks and valleys. I love the Big Leap because it explains the psychology and the upper limit problem of once you get onto a peak, it's so easy to self-sabotage, to hit that upper limit problem. And a lot of people, they just can't get through that upper limit problem. They keep trying to improve their lives, and then they keep reversing and ultimately going back to their comfort zone. And ultimately, you want to make the new peak your new comfort zone, your new identity, your new normal. You want to adapt to that, and then you want to go through the 4C cycle. Bill Gates said that most people overestimate what they can accomplish in a year, but they underestimate what they could accomplish in a decade. That same principle applies to the daily, weekly, and monthly basis. Most people overestimate or try to accomplish more in a single day, and that stops them from accomplishing a lot of things over like a week, month, or year. So in this video, I'm going to talk about why you should try to be accomplishing way less on a daily basis. So many people have like 10 items on their to-do list every single day, and that ultimately ends up being to their detriment. Let me give a very simple, practical example. Right now, I am actually training to run a 100-mile ultramarathon. I'm just getting back into shape of running. And so today, I went to the treadmill at the gym, and I did an amazing workout. I pushed myself hard on that treadmill. I ran for like 25 minutes at a very fast speed and was done. I then stretched, recovered. I used my massage gun. It was amazing. And that was this morning. And it was awesome. I walked away. But then like afternoon came and I was like, maybe I should squeeze in another run. And I thought to myself, no, if I'm trying to squeeze in too much in 24 hours, then that's going to ultimately potentially lead to injury. It's going to stop me from recovering. If I just recover and then go back and have a better, more focused, more deliberate workout tomorrow, then tomorrow's workout's gonna be better than if I worked out again today and then went to the gym. And so the point is that you wanna actually have focused, deliberate practice. In psychology, it's called deliberate practice. This is how you become an expert at anything, is you've gotta actually have targeted, specific goals, and your training takes you way outside your comfort zone, it pushes you, but then you have to actively recover. You've gotta actively recover. And if you don't do this, then you're gonna be spread too thin. There's two types of economies, as Dan Sullivan, the founder of Strategic Coach, says. There's a results economy and there's a time and effort economy. The time and effort economy are people who pride themselves on how much time it takes or how busy they are or how hard they're working, whereas the results economy just is focused on getting the result in the most effective way possible. One of the best concepts I've ever heard is from Tim Ferriss. He calls it the minimum effective dose. The idea is that there's always a dosage in order to produce the result. For example, to boil water, the dose is 212 degrees. Anything above 212 degrees is wasteful. Once you hit 212 degrees, the water boils. You don't need anything more than that. But a lot of people, they'll like go up to 250 degrees. They'll do all these different things to produce a result when it's like, no, what is the minimum effective dose? What is the most simple, most effective thing to produce a desired result? You need to get results oriented because that allows you to apply the 80-20 rule, which is what are the few things you're doing that ultimately produce the biggest result? And so here's another reason why you want to actually focus on less on a daily basis, but ultimately more high quality results. If you're trying to do 5 to 10 different things in a day, ultimately you're focused on quantity, not quality. And if you're focused on quantity over quality, then you're doing a lot of things, but you're ultimately doing it with a low level of standard. If you're focused on quality, on the other hand, then you do a few things, very focused, very precision, very smart, that ultimately allows you to make rapid progress. You do it deliberately. You're going out of your comfort zone. It's like doing a workout. You know, if you work out for 15, 20 minutes, but it was an insane workout, then if you actively recover, while you're recovering, your subconscious is processing how good that workout was. That then becomes your new baseline. You're training yourself to have new baselines. I remember when I was writing blog posts back in the day. For a long time, I was the #1 writer in the world on medium.com. And I remember learning and training myself to get into a deep flow state, write an amazing article and push publish. And I knew the articles would go viral before I even hit publish because of how it felt while I was writing it. I was just like, there's no way this isn't going to go viral. And they often did. And I trained myself to feel at that level. High performance just became a norm because when you step away and you allow yourself to psychologically detach. Psychological detachment is such a key concept. What it means is that you want to totally recover from work. You want to hit it hard and then fully turn off. And while you're fully turned off, whether you're just playing with your kids, doing some other activity, watching a movie, and this could be with anything. It could be with work, with working out, whatever it is. You want to be fully recovering, but while you're recovering, while you're away, your subconscious is actually processing the very last thing you did. So Josh Waitzkin, the guy who wrote The Art of Learning, and this is one of the best books on high performance, he talks about how he interviewed a guy named Billy Kidd once. Billy Kidd was an Olympic skier, and Billy Kidd explained to Josh what the 3 most important turns are on a ski run. A lot of people think it might be the first 3, like when you get off the chairlift and your first 3 turns set the tone for the full run. That's not true. It's actually the last 3 turns, because most people, their last 3 turns are kind of sloppy as they're getting ready to get onto the chairlift and go back up for the next run. The last 3 turns ultimately set the tone, because once you get onto the chairlift, you're now going up, and for the next 10 minutes, your subconscious is processing the last 3 things you did, and that sets the tone for your next run. And so whatever you do, it's setting the tone subconsciously for your baseline for how you do things. This is why you want to do things at a quality high level versus a quantity low level. You need to recover and psychologically detach so that during your next workout or during your next workday, you're primed to go deeper, harder, and better, so that you ultimately get better and better at that thing, pushing for better results rather than just being busy. So my invitation to you is, as Jim Collins would say, if you have more than 3 priorities, you've got none. Have no more than 3 things on your daily to-do list. Knock out the most important things at a quality level, and then turn yourself off and recover. Don't try to overly do too much. Again, as Bill Gates said, people overestimate what they can do in a short amount of time, and they underestimate how much they can do in a long amount of time. One of the reasons for that is because people, because they're so impulsive, and ultimately they don't have a long-term vision. If you have a long-term vision, you're fine doing things in a smart, intelligent way. You know, you're fine taking the long game. But if you're impulsive, if you don't have confidence, the more confidence you have, the longer version or the longer vision you will have. If you have a longer-term vision, you're willing to just take the right steps today, recover, and get back at it tomorrow and take the right steps. And ultimately, you know that the compound effect is going to speed you through. And you're making quality a way of life. And you're also going deep in your deliberate practice, so that when you hit it, you're hitting it hard. You're going way out of your comfort zone every time you do it, but you're recovering so that you've got enough to give to it. But if you're impulsive, you're going to try to squeeze a bunch of things in today, but ultimately then set yourself up for failure tomorrow. And that's ultimately going to cause you to have less long-term success, because you're constantly going up and down. You're constantly going back and forth. You're having so many inconsistent days. Again, less but better. That's the essentialist way. Do less things. Focus on results, not process. Focus on the results, and ultimately then reverse engineer the right process. Minimum effective dose. What are the few things that if you do it correctly and wisely, it's going to create exponential results and take lots of time for active recovery? Do not try to do too much in a single day. Do the few right things, recover, let your subconscious ride it. Just like being on the chairlift. While you're recovering, your brain is reprocessing the last thing you did, and you're making high performance and flow your way of being. While you're recovering, actually, you're going to be in a way more flow state with your loved ones, with whatever form of recovery you're doing. You're going to be present. You're not going to be distracted. How you do anything is how you do everything. If you go super deep while you're working, you can go super off while you're recovering. You can fully recover. You'll sleep better. You'll have less anxiety. You won't be needing to be in a million different directions. That's called decision fatigue. That's called not knowing what you want. Just define the few things you want. Don't compare yourself to anyone else, and go deep on that, and then recover and set yourself up so that tomorrow you can go even further. Recover, tomorrow you can go even further, rather than being impulsive today and then ultimately giving up before you get anywhere. Hope that helps. I'm Dr. Benjamin Hardy. Down below is access to my free 30-day Future Self course. And then right up here on the screen, a few of my other YouTube videos will pop up to help you become your future self. Have an amazing day.